All right. Good morning, Marvin.
Good morning, Commissioner Green.
I thought you were ignoring me.
Not at all. I would never do that, especially
200 miles away at this big hurry.
It's good to see everyone. I think we have everyone that we're expecting. I know the judge contacted us, I believe, yesterday and indicated the conflict came up on short notice and she would not be able to be here. So welcome, everyone. And again, I know everyone's busy, and I appreciate everyone taking the time out of their schedules to be here and to serve on the commission. Just our first order of business is a review and approval of our meeting agenda. The agenda has been provided to everyone in advance. I believe there was an updated agenda, if I'm not mistaken, that was distributed right before the meeting. Is that correct, Brian?
Yes.
All right. So I assume everyone has that. If that's the case, if there's no discussion, do I have a motion to accept the agenda for today's meeting?
So moved.
All right. Do you have a second?
I have a question.
Yes, Marvin.
I arrived this morning and found at my seat two new volumes of materials, one of which apparently is a slew of materials in response to or part of a discussion that I think is going to take place today in response to a letter the Commission has received from various defender organizations. The way I see this, and the way it's been promulgated, is that this is an executive session. Why is that?
Actually, I'm glad you raised that, Marvin, because first of all, I don't believe the Commission received that letter from the defense organizations. I think the defense organizations chose to send that letter to the IG and not the Commission. And then the IG, in turn, contacted me, I believe, last Tuesday and provided me with a copy of the letter. So the defense organizations, in essence, kind of put me in a quandary here because they chose to send it to the IG instead of the Commission. So now, we have a situation where we've received this from the IG, not from these defense organizations. And, as everyone knows, when there's a matter that may be the subject of an investigation from the IG, we need to exercise caution and, generally speaking, address those matters in executive session so we don't do anything to prejudice a potential investigation. To the best of my knowledge, I'm not aware of the fact that the IG has made any statements indicating they are not going to investigate this. So until that happens, since the defense organizations chose to send this to the IG, and the IG has not unequivocally said we're not going to do this, I think that really puts us in a bind. And like you, my inclination would be, particularly since it appears that this was given to the New York Times before it was even given to the IG, and certainly before it was brought to our attention, I would like to discuss it in open session, and I don't like the fact that we have to do it in executive session, but I think the route that these defense organizations chose to pursue really puts us in a bind and leaves us with no choice at this juncture but to do it in executive session. Certainly if anyone here disagrees, I'm more than happy to listen, but that's the way I size it up at this point.
I know you'll be shocked that I disagree. I think the fact that defender organizations or any entity files a document or documents complaining about any subject with the Inspector General, and then the Inspector General merely forwards the document to the respective agency, does not ipso facto result in an executive session. Certainly, there was nothing, and I haven't seen it, the letter that you got from the IG. Was there a cover letter from the IG saying
it's in your materials? If you look in volume 4 of your materials, the email from the IG to me with the letter from the defense organizations to the IG is included. So that's the extent of the correspondence. The letter, as I read it, the letter from the defense organization is asking the IG to conduct an investigation. And again, I am not aware of the IG making any statements indicating unequivocally that they will not do that. So as of right now, to the best of my knowledge, that request by the defense organizations to the IG to do an investigation is pending with the IG.
Well, either way, whether it's pending with the IG has indicated neither it will investigate or won't investigate. I don't understand why the conclusion that you reach is that this has to be an executive session. So you've reached that conclusion. For the record, I would make a motion to add this material in Binder 4 to the agenda for open discussion. If I can get a second, great. If I can't, the record is made. But I think it does a disservice to the public and to the laboratories around the state not to have an open discussion, particularly because there has already been a public report, I think it was on the front page of the New York Times, regarding some of the subject matter that is in what is now called colloquially Binder 4, which is before the commission this morning.
Yeah, I agree with part of what you say in terms of the position it puts us in. Frankly, personally, I would love to have an open discussion, but I think the people who drafted this letter and submitted it chose a course that left us in this bind, unfortunately. I don't like the course they chose, but they made that choice. Now we have to live with it. But certainly, you've made a motion. If there's any discussion or any second. All right, so it looks like there's no discussion or no second of that motion. So if that's the case, then we'll move on. Do we have a motion to approve the agenda for today's meeting? All right, and we have a motion. Do we have a second?
Second.
All right, all in favor? Anyone opposed? Thank you. The next item we have on the agenda is the approval of the draft minutes from our June 16th, 2017 meeting. Again, I believe the draft copy of the minutes has been circulated in your materials. If there's no discussion, do I have a motion to approve the minutes from that meeting? I have a motion. Do I have a second? All right, seconded. All in favor? Anyone opposed? Next set of items we have deals with accreditations and laboratory updates. Brian, do you want to take us through this part of the agenda?
Sure. The first item on the agenda is the Westchester Department of Laboratories Division of Forensic Toxicology. At our last meeting, they had presented accreditation documents. The Commission reviewed them. There were some outstanding items, and the Commission just asked that those items be resolved prior to the accreditation being awarded. So the accreditation was extended. So we have Betsy Spratt, the lab director, that's here. If there's any questions.
I have some questions.
Yes, Marvin. Maybe if you can wait just a minute.
She's just approaching the table.
Sure.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you for being here with us today. Go ahead, Marvin.
Who am I addressing from the lab?
Betsy Spratt.
Betsy Spratt, the director.
I can't see Dr. Spratt.
Who can you see, just so I know what seat to move her to? Can you see Bill?
She's right there. Oh, next Dan. Okay, I'm sorry.
I'm actually
Well, you can switch places so he can see you.
Or I can go over there.
Okay, I can see her. I can see her. That's fine.
Okay.
Okay, great.
Thank you, Dr. Spratt.
Thank you for
My
the
question
motion.
concerns page 65.
I don't know what 65 is.
Page 65 of our book. And it concerns item J3.
Which book?
Yes.
65?
65, J3.
65.
Yes.
Item J3.
J3.
Correct.
So this, Dr. Spratt, involved the application of a commercial methodology to specimens that had not been approved and had to be validated. Have you ever done that before? with any commercial applications in any of the forensic sciences that your lab does, where you've taken a commercial application and used a different specimen without validating? Is this unusual? I can't get my head around it and a sense of why this would have been done. Maybe that's what I need you to explain to me.
So this was validated back in 2006 and 7. The kit that we use is for serum because there is no such a kit for vitreous humor. And it's to give our medical examiners an idea of, is there a glucose involved? Is the deep degradation that's occurred with the body? So what we did was we sent vitreous humors to the hospital who used to do the testing for us. We bought a system that was what we call an open platform so that we could do the work in-house. We validated it by taking samples from us and taking them to the hospital. We sent some to NMS as well. At the time, there still is no vitreous humor control. So we were using the serum controls, and in 2015, the proficiency started. So we do have all of this data. The kits change, so the numbers change as the manufacturer changes the QC. But we've been keeping all of this data. We started with the 2015 proficiency. We thought that was the closest we could get to a vitreous type of sample. So everything's been validated. To answer your other question, we do the blood immunoassays on this same instrument. We have validated it. It's been approved in the past. We spike samples so that in blood, so that we get much lower concentrations for the drugs of abuse. So we have done this for years. This was brought in 2006, 2007, and this is being used for investigational purposes only in the vitreous.
All right. Can you explain that last line? Because I saw that as well. What does it mean it's only used for investigational purposes?
So the medical examiner has to make a decision if it's important in their case or not. So if I get a high glucose, let me go back. When you die, your glucose in the vitreous should be less than 20. If somebody is an out-of-control diabetic, they'll have a much higher glucose level still in their vitreous humor. So we get a small portion of that because it's the fluid from your eye, so we don't get an awful lot. They then make the decision, is it ketoacidosis or not, or is it somebody who's not taking their medication? And then they use all of the circumstances to make the determination if this was an important factor or not. That's why we call it investigational only, because we can't determine how important it is. They have to make that decision. They've asked us to bring this in many years ago. There was not a piece of equipment to do this. We knew that we could do it with this, what we call open platform, so that's the reason we did it.
This testing and material, which is done for investigational purposes only, is it submitted into the LIMS system of the lab?
Yes, the results are reported in the LIMS system, and then the medical examiner receives a hard copy of the results, and then they make the decision what they want to do with it. We do not.
So the application here, at least at a practical level, not at the glucose levels, because I'm not a scientist. I don't understand the glucose levels, but I do understand I think the import of what you're saying. The issue is if the glucose levels are they're out of kilter, or they're higher or lower, that could influence the medical examiner's decision as to the cause of death.
Correct.
And so if the person that the medical examiner has on the table, he looks at your report, he sees the report, he might conclude that the reason the person died was because of diabetes or diabetic shock.
Yes.
Right. So this investigational purpose and this validating of this commercial methodology is really important, because if it's off, the medical examiner could, not saying will, but he could make the wrong decision.
Well, yes and no, because when you die, the vitreous humor, your glucose decreases very quickly if you're a controlled person. So they're looking for less than 20 milligrams per dl in a normal person in the eye fluid. If you're out of control, it doesn't matter if it's 300 or 600, we do all kinds of dilutions for them. It just gives them an idea if that was part of the death.
Doctor, are you satisfied as you sit here today that 3 that we're referring to, page 65 of our book, has been put to rest, that you're satisfied as a scientist at the lab that using the commercial application in the way you're using it will not lead to an error in reporting to the medical examiner?
I am, and we're also going to start accumulation of cases that can be thrown out, and we're going to you see, you have to fortify a regular vitreous sample from different people, so we're going to start that, and we're going to fortify it to make sure that we have the glucose. But we also are passing the proficiencies, so that was a second check for us since 2015, showing us that our work is correct.
Great. Thank you very much, Doctor.
If I could ask, do you know how other forensic tox labs are handling this situation?
Most labs do not do it.
Don't do vitreous?
Very difficult.
We encountered this once before with another lab that had problems with vitreous, and because they didn't normally do it and didn't have standards.
And is this just testing of the vitreous for the glucose, or is this any testing of vitreous?
We test glucose, BUN, creatinine, potassium, and chloride. And the only other one that's really important for degradation, decomp, is the potassium and the chlorides. And we were using those same controls from the kit, and we've been making sure that they're within limits, and that's all included in that proficiency, and that is what we've been passing as well.
Is this separate from any testing of the vitreous for tox or alcohol?
No, we do use the vitreous for alcohol if the blood is positive for alcohol, and we also use the vitreous for 6-MAM if we do not have urine enough to see if the person used heroin. So that sort of decreases because you don't get much. If you get 2 mils, it's a lot. And also depends on who's taking it, because when we get the stuff from the eye bank, the last case had the eyeball in it versus just the vitreous. So it makes our life a little harder. So we do use the vitreous for other testing. If that's all we had, we would look for cocaine if we had to, because the drugs do stay in the vitreous a little bit longer. So that's why it can be important. And that's all been tested that we've done.
Yeah, I was asking, I was recalling back to my days as a prosecutor, when we got autopsy reports in Monroe County, there was always an indication if it was alcohol or drug involved. It was generally blood, urine, vitreous humor, showing the results in all of them. So I'm assuming that they were doing the vitreous testing at that point. Has anyone else been able to validate it?
Well, they're doing the alcohol testing, but most of the labs are not doing the chemistries. That's separate from doing the alcohol testing. That's a whole different set of tests in order to get those results. So I know there are quite a few that are not doing it. There's a new instrument out. We don't have it because I've got this open platform I can use. So I don't plan to change to that because we've already got this validated and proficiencies run on it. So we are going to keep track of every single thing we see, meaning the potassium, the chlorides, and everything else. But they change with the degradation of the sample itself. So we've got to find a middle road where we freeze it after we've done a validation of so many times and then see how it changes, because it's just very hard to do this.
All right, thank you.
I just have a couple of follow-ups. When we talk about looking at potassium, which is part of this, that's actually used in time of death determinations, which to me is fairly critical, and I don't know from a prosecutor's perspective also. And I guess the concern I have is that there's a specific finding that it's not validated in the matrix, meaning vitreous humor, it's validated in serum. So ABFT looked and said, we gave you a specific finding, it's not challenged, it's not resolved. So essentially, we have an outstanding finding. So I understand there's validation, but it's not validation in the matrix, which is the vitreous humor.
We did validate it by sending samples out to another laboratory. That's the only way we could validate it. And so we're going to keep track once we accumulate all of those blank samples, and not really blanks, they're from all the other deaths that we have that we do get vitreous humor, and we are going to track it to see if we can come up with a control other than what's provided by the kit.
I guess my concern is when we send it out, we don't know if they're using vitreous humor. And because we don't, if there is actually some matrix effect or matrix shift, you don't know if the proficiency test or the outside testing is actually addressing it. because if there is some type of shift, you wouldn't know if they're using the same thing. You
But
could
if
all be
I'm
wrong.
passing my proficiencies, which is a vitreous proficiency, it's showing that I am getting the correct results. And it's, again, been since 2015.
If, in fact, you know they 100% didn't use the serum ones like you've been using.
I would have no way of telling what CAP does.
Right, so that's
But the
my concern.
PT analyst, the PT provider knows that she's doing vitreous humor, and they know what instruments she's using, and they should be grading according to everybody using that instrument on that. So if she's passing, they know what matrix she used and what instrument she used, and they compared her results to anybody else using the same combination. So if she's passing PT, the PT provider is saying you're using the right instrument on the right.
I think that's an overinterpretation, in my opinion, because essentially they work off of consensus results.
Yeah.
So if 75% of the people get the same result,
But
that's considered a
it's
positive result.
75% of you have to subcategorize your group by the method they're using.
But if everybody's using serum,
No.
you don't know.
No. This is a vitreous humor proficiency.
Right, but you're doing a vitreous humor proficiency and your standards are in serum. So if everyone is doing the same thing, that shift wouldn't show. And I guess the thing that would have made me feel more comfortable is if ABFT said we're withdrawing this finding because there's no way to validate it, but they didn't. They've withheld it. So the external accrediting body is essentially saying that you shouldn't be doing it this way. You have a finding in the initial documentation that you said we've got this way to fix it, but we haven't produced that way to fix it yet.
But I'm going to argue she also validated it by sending vitreous humor to another lab that did vitreous humor and comparing her results on the vitreous humor to their results on the vitreous humor. That would be the only way to validate it.
I think the way she proposed was actually a good way, which is you take vitreous humor samples, you use the word fortify, I use the word spike, where you basically take them, add different things to them, then see if you can detect them at those levels.
Yeah, but you have to be careful because there's only a short range of each one of these components that we can look for. So you don't want to overspike them. So we have to be very careful. So we're hoping that because glucose is what decreases the quickest in the vitreous humor, that's what needs to be fortified. So we're hoping that once we do, say, a pool of 50 samples, we can get a potassium chloride, again, those aren't as important to the doctor as the glucose is. Sometimes they do use the potassium or the calcium, but we don't do calcium, sorry, chloride. They're basically looking at it as just a guideline. The main thing for them is the glucose. So we are going to see if we get a big degradation once we mix them, fortify just for the glucose and freeze them. You don't want to go way outside of that range or it'll be a worthless QC.
But I guess if we just, without getting into the weeds, my thought process, you have an external accreditation provider, which is a discipline-specific subject matter expert, which is saying this was a problem. We're saying that the validation still is not 100% complete, and we're doing it, and we're one of the few labs in the state that are doing it. So I guess I'm concerned that I don't feel comfortable allowing that type of analysis to move forward.
So one of the emails, Brian, that I sent you was with Graham saying that he has no problem with the validation. He was more concerned that there wasn't an additional control. So he has no problem with the validation. We put the summary together so that we had the summary of what we've done with the proficiencies, and that we will now try to have this additional QC in order to do this. So he had no problem with the validation and said that in one of the emails that I did send you.
Except I'm still not getting the sequitur, though. And the investigative purposes only still concerns me because time of death determination, I think, is fairly critical. And I think the other things, and essentially, if you're giving it to anybody to use for anything, like the investigative purposes things doesn't make sense to me. If you have a result and you give it to someone and they do something with it, then it has value. And if you don't give it to them, like maybe there's a sliding scale if it has value. Maybe if it's this or it's this, it helps the medical examiner. But I just don't feel comfortable with that level of precision and accuracy. That's just
it is a sliding scale because if it's a decomposed body, they don't really care what some of these numbers are. They're more interested in is there a glucose there. So, in fact, a lot of those we do or we don't get. It's a very small percentage that we do now. So the critical one is the glucose, and we've done all of the other work as well. So I mean, to me, again, passing the proficiencies as well as having all of the QC from the day one, we've got that data and showing that we're passing with that. It's the best that's out there. I mean, I think one of the reasons the two people who came from National Medical was the fact that they felt that we should add this vitreous. They do basically the same thing, and they have a vitreous control. That's what brought this up.
Any other questions or conversation? Yes.
Dr. Spratt, your remarks caused me to ask you one more question that comes up from
Sorry.
time to time in discussions here. When you send the sample out for additional testing to another lab, is the lab that you send it to an accredited lab?
For other work well, the clinical lab is a clinical lab. That was a long time ago. National Medical is accredited, so yes.
Okay.
Not by this organization.
Yes, they are by ABFT.
Oh,
Yeah, they are by ABFT as well as our Fed Lab.
Okay. Thank you.
Pat?
Betsy, I have one question. So after you received your validation or the results back from NMS, how did you performance check your instrument? Just proficiency tests?
No,
Was
we
there a
looked at the
performance check
results.
that it was involved?
You mean with this way back when we first did this, Pat?
Well, when you got your results back from NMS, you sent out samples to NMS so that they can validate the current system that you're using. How did you essentially performance check your own instruments after you received their data to make sure that what you're going to be doing is going to comply with, their procedures?
We basically looked at the results to see within what percentage we ran. And again, most of them were done to the hospital, by the way, because they were the original lab that did most of our work in the very beginning. So we just compared the results to make sure that what we were doing was accurate. We found that we needed to dilute some of the samples because of the viscosity to get the glucose levels to work within the range. So that's really what we did. We compared our results with theirs and then just documented that they were all there.
And then you re-optimized based upon your percentages.
There's really no way to re-optimize. You still have to use the kit's controls and standards. Okay. Basically, it's, again, fell well within the percentage that we needed to fall.
Mike, I have a question. It's Lydia DeCastro.
Yes.
How are the results reported to the medical examiners? And how do they differ from a result if it had been able to have been the test optimized the way ABFT had suggested? So how do they get a result now?
They get a report that gives all of the results, and on top of the report it says for investigational purposes only. So it's, and again, it changes if we, that's the reason we put it that way, and that's the way our medical examiner wanted it. It does not go on our final.
They were content with. They were content with that caveat that they really couldn't. They could use it as a guide, but not as a be-all and end-all.
Yes, and that's how they're using it as a guide.
Thank you.
Ann?
Michael, I'm sorry.
Hang on, Marvin. Ann's been waiting. We'll
That's
get
okay.
right after Ann.
Do you have an SOP for validation in your lab? A standard approach?
We do. Mm-hmm.
And does it address the number of samples that need to be run and accuracy, reproducibility, et cetera?
Absolutely. And all of our QC, ABFT requires plus or minus 20% is allowed there. We take care and we plot CVs and everything, and to make sure, in fact, we just added bias, which was a request that was made to us. So we do have a standard operating procedure. This is a little bit outside the realm since it is one of the older procedures we've got, but we did all of this data before we...
It's actually the information on page 21 about the acetaminophen and salicylate that prompted that question, because the validation report just seemed pretty sparse in terms of what it was trying to convey to us.
21.
So what was happening is we were transitioning from our HPLC instrument, which was not as sensitive, to our LCMS instrument. We are having a major problem with the software from the instrument manufacturer. So we stopped doing some of the work because the extraction did not change. What changed on the LCMS is we're getting much lower sensitivity, and we were looking for a much broader range in order to be able to see these. We don't do very many acetaminophen, only if we feel that it's within a toxic range because of other drugs that we may see. So we're following that procedure, but we had to back off even from the last commission meeting because we could not even print any of our results. So we quit doing work until we got that portion fixed, which we did do, and then we're in the process of, we finalized the method so that we can use it.
And then the other question that I have is, and this may be my misunderstanding, but do you equate a drug screen with a qualitative test?
We have a couple different, that I have to say that was not easy for me either to do that. Yes, our qualitative work is either on the time of flight or the immunoassay screen that we use. Depending on the drug, we then go to a more specific confirmation. So when you see the technique on the right, that's usually where we screened it from, and for instance, say a fentanyl or whatever. Once we do that confirmation, then that's the technique you'll see that we use to finally give you the number.
Okay, so you have a cutoff. If it's over the cutoff, you call it a positive screen, and then you confirm it.
And we also, well, it's not a black and white cutoff because we know that some of the drugs don't react as strongly to the screens as the others. So we use it again as a guide, and then we'll go and confirm it. If it doesn't come out positive, then it obviously does not get marked on there at all.
Okay.
Marvin? Or Scott? Whichever one of you wants to go.
I have to reframe my question.
Betsy, I don't think you have the answer. It's more for Brian. Brian, Betsy mentioned that there was a communication from Dr. Graham illustrating that they were okay with the current practice, because as you said, there is a current finding of non-conformance. Is that in the binders that we have? I can't seem to find it.
It is not in the binder. I'll try and find it right now. Maybe if that's something you guys want to hold to, we can put this on hold, revisit it. I can try and pull that up and get it printed and distributed. Or I can read from it.
It's the same thing.
Me too.
I was going to make the same request.
What we requested.
Scary, really.
I'm just.
Did you have something further, Marvin?
Yes.
Go ahead.
Mike, this is a question addressed to you. And is Mr. Fitzpatrick at the meeting?
Yes, but he's...
Sat in on the right. He looks like he lost a lot of weight. I couldn't recognize him.
Did he?
Hold on 1 second, let me fix that.
The question that I have, Michael, is to
I
you.
lost weight because I'm sitting next to Brian.
Easy. Very public now, Bill.
It's going to be a while to get that one. The question I have, Michael, is to you and Mr. Fitzpatrick. In all the years that you were prosecutor, and Bill's still a prosecutor, have you ever seen documents in a medical examiner's file that were marked for investigational purposes only? I'm thinking back to my experience as a defense attorney going back 43 years. I can't remember ever seeing such a designation required by a medical examiner. And just so I'm totally transparent with both of you, what I'm nervous about when I hear this, and Brian, I think, asked a question about it, investigational purposes only, is the Brady rule. Because my fear is that somebody takes a look at this, there's something for investigational purposes only, and decides that, well, maybe it's Brady, maybe it's not, but since it was only for an investigational purpose, it has no value as Brady. So
Yeah,
I'm
Marvin,
just
this
trying to figure
may-
out why this is even in a medical examiner's request from one of the laboratories under our jurisdiction.
This may shock you, but I think we were thinking along similar lines, because as I'm sitting here listening to this conversation, I'm putting myself in a courtroom setting and trying to think, if you're a medical examiner on the stand being asked questions about the time of death, how do you sort out how you're allowed to use one test that was from a procedure that was validated as opposed to how you're allowed to weigh something that was marked for investigational purposes only. And I think, you get to a point where you're, trying to see how many angels can dance on the head of a pin. And I think eventually as you play this out, that's a distinction that becomes untenable at some point. So I'm somewhat comfortable with everything you've described in terms of your efforts to validate and your proficiency testing, and that, to me, sounds like, in my lay opinion, you've done everything you can do, but I'm not at all comfortable with the commission somehow putting our stamp on this distinction between, investigative versus full-blown use. So, I share your concern there, and I'm not quite sure how we weigh it out in this particular case, but I don't like, this investigative label is somehow like a lesser way that you can do testing, because I don't think when you play it out, it's a situation that's sustainable.
So my position would be that this should not in any way inure to the detriment of Dr. Spratt and her laboratory. I agree with you. She has set forth today very lucidly and calmly how she has tried to address the problem. I'm not a scientist, but it sounded to me like she's trying to get this under control and be very careful. So you and I agree on that. Number two, Dr. Spratt says the term investigational purposes only is required of her by the medical examiner. So the next question I have is, I assume this medical examiner's office is under our jurisdiction. Would that be correct?
The lab is under our jurisdiction, but I don't believe the medical examiner's office itself is.
DOA.
Well,
yeah, they'd be under the jurisdiction, I think, of the Department of... No?
To the extent that they're under anyone's jurisdiction.
Yeah, I don't think they are.
I'm sorry,
I
Mark,
couldn't
go ahead.
hear.
Yeah, we were just discussing whether or not they would be under the jurisdiction of the Department of Health, but I don't think we know that they are.
Okay, here's my suggestion. I think we need to send a letter from the Commission on Forensic Science to the medical examiner, telling the medical examiner forthrightly the discussion we've had with Dr. Spratt, and request of the medical examiner why he requires this terminology, investigational purposes only. I don't think that's a terribly difficult request. I think it would help clarify what it is that Dr. Spratt is required to do. That is under our jurisdiction, and it should take all of about 20 minutes to write such a letter and send it out.
Betsy, I just want to clarify, is it the medical examiner that's telling you to use this investigational language?
It was originally, because it's only a small part of what they do for the whole case. But they like to have this information because it helps them if there's any concern, mostly about the glucose, to be honest with you. That's the main thing they look at. So because it doesn't really fall under a real clinical or medical examiner type of work, they've asked us originally when we started it to call it investigational purposes only, because it's not the end all for them to make a decision. It is a help when somebody is a ketoacidosis, and that's the reason they like this information. We chose to give them the whole panel because they like to see that information as well. So they came up with the idea that it's investigational purposes only. We're as accurate as we can be for the type of sample and the type of death and the timing. If you want me to take off the word investigational purposes only, I can do that. It's not going to change anything, really.
No, I know, but my concern, I think Marvin's concern, is if you play this out and you or the medical examiner's in court under oath being questioned, and the time of death is a key issue in the case, and they start breaking down every single factor that went into the decision, to whatever opinion was formed as to the time of death, and you start trying to split out, okay, this one was for investigational purposes, so I only relied on it this much, but this one wasn't investigated. I just think it ultimately is not a distinction which is sustainable when you get to that level of scrutiny. And So I guess that's what concerns me is, we should be in a position, if we're satisfied that you have done everything you need to do and can possibly do to validate this, then, you should be allowed to do it and report on it. And if we're not satisfied, then you probably shouldn't be allowed to do it and report on it. That's my thought.
So scientifically, when there are limitations to the methodology, there are interfering substances, there are degradation reasons, there are, a lab director can include in the report, I've done it, validated method, controls that are available, proficiency test has been passed. However, this particular assay on this particular substrate has limitations. And they would include those, they could include that language of limitation. So then the OCME says, yes, I've relied on this assay, it does have limitations.
That makes a lot more sense to me because, and everybody knows what you're talking about. The defense knows, the judge knows, the prosecutor knows, because I think one of the problems with this investigative label is what does that really mean? But I think your solution, I don't know what other people think, but I would be very comfortable if instead of this investigative label, you just footnoted somewhere in the report or whatever it is you send what the limitation is. I don't know, Marvin, your thoughts on that?
I think that's a perfect solution. Just so that we're clear, though, Dr. Spratt, the limitation notice should be clear on the face of the paper.
Yeah.
Right?
It's a footnote.
We've had in the past, in other situations where we're considering accreditation,
small print somewhere,
where the limitation was not noted or was noted in such a non-transparent way that anybody reading the report wouldn't be aware that there was a limitation. So I agree with Michael. If you do that and say there are limitations on this, then a prosecutor in his or her office and a defense attorney in his or her office who sees the words "some limitations," I am sure bells and whistles will go off. They will ask their experts and their witnesses what that means, and we can have a full discussion, yes or no, in a court of law. Is that okay with you, Dr. Spratt?
I have no problem doing that. I'll have it printed out just like we have the header. I'll have it as a footnote saying, and I'll work with Ann Willie to help me put the exact wording for the limitations. Because I don't have a problem. There are, I'm sorry?
The term investigational use only is finished.
Goes away.
You want that to go away?
Yes.
And then what? Okay, we'll remove that, and then we'll put a limitations based on the type of sample, that there may be some limitations for the results based on the type of sample.
Perfect.
That work?
All right, so then do I have a motion to renew the New York State accreditation for the Westchester County Department of Laboratories and Research, Division of Toxicology, covering September 13th, 2017 to June 30th, 2019, with the caveat or the understanding that with regard to this one issue, any reporting they do will be changed, the investigative language will be taken out, and the language that we discussed with regard to subject to a limitation and spelling out what that limitation will be included. Do I have a motion to that effect?
Before we take the vote, I just wanted to ask, I am still, though I was wondering about the letter from Dr. Graham or the email, because right now ABFT is still marked as a no. So I'm just wondering if that is something that could also be, I don't want to hold the lab from moving forward with accreditation.
Do you want to put the vote off and see if we can get you that before we vote?
I have the email, but there's nothing, I can read the entire exchange if you'd like, but there's nothing, Dr. Graham is CC'd, but there's nothing of anything on it. I can read the entire exchange if you want.
I think, I just want to understand this in regard to J3, ABFT is satisfied with Betsy Spratt's response. Is that, even if...
Our original response was the fact that we were going to try to use the older proficiencies, and so that was okay back when we said that was our response. When we tried to do that, there wasn't enough sample from the old proficiencies. So that's when it came up, what are we going to do next? And so then we went back and forth with Graham and decided to try the fortification of the vitreous. He was satisfied with the validation. He just wanted this additional QC. So those are two things added there.
Sure. And so your solution to this was in conjunction with Dr. Graham?
It was.
Yeah, I've got an alternative suggestion here. Yeah, I'm very comfortable with the motion we made, but given the fact that we have this non-conformance noted, and we don't seem to have anything clearly indicating from ABFT that they're okay with, what you've put forward, would it make sense to extend your accreditation through the end of the next meeting with the understanding that you go back to ABFT, spell out everything you've given to us, how you intend to now note the results going forward, and ask them to then give you an indication that they're okay with that, and that they'll change this nonconformance?
I can talk to Graham. I know he did give that information to us. I thought Brian was copied on that email. I apologize if I didn't send to you, Brian. I will make sure that they say yes to J3 with our, because in fact I even talked to him about how did he spike his samples so that we could follow the same way.
Scott, would you be more comfortable with that path?
I'm actually comfortable with Betsy's verbal response right now, but I just think that's something that we should follow up on maybe. I would hate to be delaying her accreditation for another extension. I like your solution, Commissioner Green, in regards to the investigative only. Yeah, and Marvin's agreement with that. So as long as Betsy, I believe Betsy, our word that Dr. Graham, came up with a solution with her. So I believe that may be acceptable.
All right, then why don't I'll go back to the original motion I made, and I'll add one more thing to it, that it's subject to confirmation of what you're indicating was a correspondence with ABFT where they indicated that this was okay and they'd remove the nonconformity. So if you can just get us at the next meeting, we can vote now, but subject to you getting us the confirmation from ABFT, and also provide us, if you would, with the language as it's going to go on the report.
I'll give you a copy of how we changed it. That's no problem.
All right, with that understanding, do we have a second to the motion? We have a second. All in favor?
Aye.
Anyone opposed? All right, and any abstentions? All right, thank you very much. Appreciate the information.
Okay, the next laboratory is the Yonkers Police Department Forensic Science Laboratory. They had an assessment. A vote is required. I believe the director is in the New York location. If there's any questions, materials in your binders start on page 72. Does anyone have any questions for Yonkers?
If not, do I have a motion to renew the New York State accreditation to the Yonkers Police Department Forensic Science Lab for the period concurrent with its ASCLD lab accreditation from July 20th, 2017 to December 30th, 2021?
I have just a question. Michael, is this laboratory accreditation under ANAB, operating on behalf of, or instead of ASCLD lab?
Well, I think if I remember right, didn't we vote at the last meeting that basically until we get this corporate issue resolved, that when we use ASCLD lab or ANAB, that we're using them interchangeably?
I'm not asking. I'm not contesting that at all. I just want to know, for this accreditation, was it ANAB who actually physically did it? It must have been, because ASCLD lab's out of business. They're part of it. Or they're part of subsidiary. Am I right?
No, that's what it says. ANAB renews the accreditation.
I think it answers my question. Thank you.
All right. All right, so do I have a motion? Do I have a second? All right, all in favor? Anyone opposed? And any abstentions? Thank you.
At the last commission meeting, the Erie County Medical Examiner's Toxicology Lab was up for a mid-cycle review. During that, there were some questions asked about their last external. Since that time, the director has provided some documentation just clarifying some of the statements she made at the commission meeting in June. So those documents are on page 84 to 87 of your binders. If there's any questions, the lab director is available via phone. Hearing none, the next laboratory is the Monroe County Crime Laboratory. They have a continuation of accreditation with an off-site visit and surveillance report. Documentation starts on page 88 of your binders. Okay. If there's no questions on that, the next laboratory is the Monroe County Medical Examiner's Toxicology Laboratory. They just recently received a letter from ABFT acknowledging their mid-cycle review. It's on page 166, and that's one of the supplemental documents you received. It's not in the actual binder, so it's got a blue number on the bottom if you wanted to see it, but it's just a letter saying we acknowledge and review your mid-cycle review.
Binder 3. It's in binder 3.
Binder 3 if you need to look at that. If there's no questions regarding that, the next is the New York State Police Crime Laboratory. They have a letter about some top and key management notifications, and also they have a continuation of accreditation after an offsite. So the documentation for that starts on page 95 of your binders, first binder. Next laboratory is the Niagara County Sheriff's Office Forensic Laboratory. And again, a continuation of accreditation with an off-site surveillance report. That starts on page 103 of your binders, the first one. Next laboratory is the Suffolk County Crime Laboratory. So they've got some assessment reports that are in there, starting on page 167. And that's a binder 3, I believe. Next laboratory is the Suffolk County Medical Examiner Toxicology Laboratory. They have a mid-cycle self-assessment, and they have a letter from ABFT just with continuation compliance. So the initial documents are on page 110 to 114 of your first binder, and then the letter that just came in is on 114.1, which is one of the little supplements you received. Next laboratory is the Westchester Department of Public Safety Crime Laboratory. There's an off-site surveillance visit, and the documents are included in your binder, page 115. Last item under accreditation is the DCGS Latent Print Laboratory. This is the first laboratory, to my knowledge, in the country, and I believe that they're going to get accreditation certificate 0001 for switching over completely to the ABFT program. So they are actually completely
on the ANAB.
The ANAB program. Thank you. That was a bit awkward. To the ANAB program. No vote is required. It's just informational purposes, and this is something that you received as a handout just now. You should have received it.
So I have a question.
Sure.
About pages 123 and 124, which is root causes for non-conformance. Are we all on the same page? And this is in a binder that has no number.
The original.
The original binder.
One.
Right.
Non-disclosures.
What page?
123 and 123.
That's a lab disclosure. I don't. It's item 6A.
So I think that's not part of the section we're looking at now, right?
Right.
That's going to be part of lab disclosures. That's going to come up later.
Yep.
Okay.
So just moving through the agenda, the first item is accreditation updates. Then the next item after that's old business, new business, then lab disclosures.
Yeah, so if you can just hold that thought for a few minutes, we'll get to it shortly.
Sure.
All right. So that ends the accreditation updates.
Under. Yeah, it's the first item under number 6 on the agenda, so it will be there in just a few minutes. So the next major item we have, number 5, old business. And the first item there is a comparison of accreditation programs. I believe it was our last meeting, we heard from a representative from ANAB, Andor Asclad. So I believe at this meeting, if I'm not mistaken, we have someone from A2LA here to give us some information on their program. Is that correct, Brian?
Correct.
Yeah. Any questions or comments before we proceed with that? All right, so is it Randall Query?
Correct.
Maybe if you can just come up and sit next to Mr. Fitzpatrick there on this side.
They've never appeared here before.
So first, thank you for coming here. We appreciate it and look forward to hearing what you have to say. Maybe if you can just start by introducing yourself and then make a statement, whatever you want to tell us about your program and how you think it would benefit us in New York.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the opportunity for being here at the hearing. I'm Randy Query. I'm the accreditation manager for clinical forensics and proficiency testing provider programs at A2LA. I've been with A2LA since 1998, so 20 years now, or 19 years. A little bit of background on A2LA. A2LA is a nonprofit public service membership organization whose mission is to provide independent, world-class accreditation and training programs that inspire confidence in the quality of the services and acceptance of results from the accredited organizations. We were established nearly 40 years ago in 1978. Over the decades, we have grown from the first accredited laboratory being accredited as an environmental lab that still remains with us today, to the 3,218 accreditations that we currently have active, 2 of which are New York State government labs here in Albany. We are governed by the board of directors that are composed of members from the various industry sectors that we offer accreditation, and the board of directors include liaisons from the federal government agencies that rely on our accreditation. The president and chief executive officer, Lonnie Spires, reports to the A2LA board of directors. He oversees the full-time staff that's employed at A2LA headquarters in Frederick, Maryland. The full-time staff includes 65 employees. Approximately 2/3 of those work in accreditation services. The Accreditation Services Department is primarily responsible for assisting the laboratories navigate the accreditation process. The other departments include training, financial services, quality, marketing, sales, and government relations. The accreditation officers, or the laboratory account managers, all hold bachelor's degrees. However, they're not the technical experts. They're not the assessors. We rely on technical experts that we have contracted that are current in the industry. We have an assessor corps of approximately 200 technical experts to cover the breadth of our accreditation programs. 28 assessors are contracted to do forensics work. We also have an accreditation council that is composed of technical experts that are volunteers. They volunteer their time and efforts in reviewing the accreditation packages, which are the assessor's reports and then the corrective action responses we receive from our applicants. A panel is selected from the accreditation council based on their technical background to independently review those assessment packages and either vote for, against, or abstain on accreditation. So that review process is 2-tiered. You have the assessors that perform the fact-finding mission on site, and then based on the results of that, an accreditation council then reviews that to make the decision on accreditation.
I'm sorry, I apologize if you said already, but how many people on the accreditation council?
Oh, I did not say. I don't have that number with me, but it's well over 100. I'm thinking close to 150, but that includes all of our programs. So specific forensics, I don't exactly have that number, but I would think it'd be maybe a quarter of that total number.
So that group, if it's a quarter of that, my math isn't great, but somewhere in the 30s maybe, that group of 20 or 30 or 40 people or whatever it is would be reviewing the results from the assessors who went out in the field and then deciding whether or not to grant accreditation?
No. Typically, 3 individuals from that group would be selected to review the package and then vote for accreditation.
All right, and what's the, just generally speaking, what's the background of the people on that group?
So similar to our assessors, they would have to have working experience in forensics, and they would have a technical discipline, say latent prints, and so we would want to make sure that scope of accreditation, the breadth of that scope of disciplines is covered by the individuals on the AC, on the accreditation council.
All right.
So it may be more than 3 that may be selected just to ensure that we have full coverage of those technical aspects. We also have a criteria council, again, made up of technical volunteers. They're responsible for reviewing our criteria documents, our policies and procedures, and they would approve those before those are implemented. Technical advisory committees are composed of association members, laboratories, assessors, and other interested parties. These advisory committees are where the criteria documents would start and where they are updated and then moved on to that criteria council for approval. So the structure of our organization promotes transparency in our processes, policies, and procedures, but it's also rigid. It has rigid safeguards that are in place to ensure that we maintain confidentiality and guard against any conflicts of interest. So as far as the accreditation process, I won't go into great detail only as you have questions, but the accreditation process at the 50,000-foot level is very similar to what you'd see with other accreditation bodies, because we're all operating to ISO 1711. Our systems are in place, so there are going to be similarities. I want to highlight some areas that I think strong for A2LA. Assessor selection for assignments. So to prevent any conflicts of interest, we propose the assessor assignments to the laboratories to review to ensure that they don't have a conflict, like they don't work for a competitor or they haven't worked at that lab in recent past, or provide consulting services. But also we propose the assignment to the assessors so they can inform us if there were any conflicts of interest that they may have. So that agreement's made at the time of the assignments. We want to ensure that the appropriate technical match is in place to cover, that the assessment team can cover all aspects of the accreditation scopes. A second point to highlight is our assessor monitoring. So we send our assessors or provide assessor training. Even if they've worked for other accreditation bodies, we still want them to attend our 5-day assessor training to have a full understanding of ISO 17025, but also our A2LA policies, say on measurement traceability or measurement uncertainty or proficiency testing. So after taking the 5-day interactive course, they must pass a written exam. Then once they're assigned to their first assessment, we send a staff member out to evaluate that assessor to ensure that they're meeting the requirements of what we expect in an assessment. You can have a very incredible technical expert that has certifications and doctorate degrees, but if they can't interact with the lab personnel, it's not going to result in a very effective assessment. So we want to watch that. And then we provide them with written feedback following their first assessment. When they're ready to become a lead assessor, again, we send someone out to observe and watch them perform the assessment to see that they're meeting our expectations. And then once signed off, we do that every 3 years based on their performance or any issues we may have heard, but typically it's on a 3-year cycle that we will, again, do assessor oversights. Also, they're being reviewed by A2LA staff on every assessment through the review of their assessment reports to ensure that the deficiencies that may be cited are valid. And then the AC, the Accreditation Council, also has an opportunity to evaluate the assessors on those assessments based on their review of the assessment reports. And finally, our applicant laboratories have the opportunity to provide feedback through surveys following the full assessments to let us know how the assessors performed and how staff has performed during that assessment process. That occurs once accreditation is granted, so that there isn't any pressure on the lab to, impact their feedback for us. Finally, another highlight is the on-site assessment technique. We stress to our assessors that we would like them to watch the actual test being performed, if possible, if time allows, for much of the scope. We think there's a lot of benefit in seeing tests being performed, but that's also augmented with, interviewing the personnel, reviewing the records, of course, reviewing the documents, and evaluating the equipment, the support equipment, the facilities, and media used. Expectations for corrective action responses. We do not permit deficiencies to be closed on site. So if the assessor identifies a deficiency and the laboratory would like to correct it, that tends to lead, we believe, to Band-Aid approaches, quick fixes. And we want to encourage that a root cause investigation is being performed. And so we would rather have that follow up after the on-site assessment has occurred. So we have detailed deficiencies that are finalized and provide to the laboratory, that they then have an ample time to put some thought behind it, do a root cause investigation, provide us with that and the corrective action and objective evidence that that deficiency has been addressed and implemented. The corrective action has been addressed and implemented. Transparency in the process. In the event that the laboratory appeals or contests a deficiency, we handle it openly by relaying that information to the assessor for review, and if the deficiency continues to stand, we have the Accreditation Council review the response, but this is done openly and timely to ensure so that the laboratory understands that we're hearing both sides of the story and we want to get the best results out of that. So in regards to recognition, recognition of our programs has always been important to our association. We were a founding signatory to the International Laboratory Accreditation Cooperation, ILAC, Mutual Recognition Arrangement, and we remain very active in ILAC, and also in the Asia-Pacific Laboratory Accreditation Cooperation and the Inter-American Accreditation Cooperation. We also work hard to earn our domestic recognitions. Recently, we received the Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services CMS deemed status to provide clinical lab accreditation to our clinical labs to the CLIA requirements, but also we are recognized by the EPA, the FCC, the FFA, the NELAC Institute, which is responsible for the environmental laboratory. It's a national program. So through these agencies and industry partners, they rely on us to provide the accreditation programs based on the ISO standards, yet each one has a unique wrinkle that they ask us to incorporate to meet their specific needs. So we can tailor programs and meet their needs while maintaining the ISO accreditation standards. So we are open to working with you and meeting the needs that you have specific to the users of your program, and to continue to make this a rigorous, effective accreditation offering. So thank you.
Maybe if I can, just a couple questions, and I'll probably display my ignorance by asking them, but in terms of the cycle that you accredit on and mid-cycle and things like that, can you describe that?
Sure. So we're based on, most of our programs are based on a 2-year cycle of accreditation. We will conduct an initial full assessment of the entire scope in the first year. In the second year, for a new laboratory, we will conduct a surveillance assessment that normally is focused at the management system requirements and the to follow up on any deficiencies that may have been identified in that first year to ensure that what they put into place has really taken hold and has been effective. And then
is that an on-site?
Yes, that's an on-site surveillance assessment. And then in the third year would be a full renewal assessment, again, very similar to that first initial assessment, where we're looking at everything on the scope of accreditation.
What about an established laboratory?
So they're on a 2-year cycle. The 1 year would be a full renewal assessment. The following year, we do not show up on site. We have what's called an annual review of accreditation. They will provide us updated information on their organizational chart. They may, we ask for internal audit records and management review records that have occurred since our last on-site assessment. And we're doing ongoing review of proficiency testing results. We think that's an important tool for the accreditation bodies in that it gives us a picture of what's occurring when we're not on site.
You also mentioned, I believe, 17011 ISO standard, and I'm familiar with 17025, but what's the difference? What's the relationship?
Sure. So with 17025 and 1711, they're both similar structures in that you have basically 2 chapters, management system and technical. 1711 specific to accreditation bodies, and it has requirements for internal audits, management reviews for the accreditation body, and how we handle our assessments and the assessment cycles, reporting, those types of things, confidentiality, non-conforming work, all that. So it's so similar to what our laboratories go through in having to meet requirements of 17025, the accreditation bodies have to go through to meet the requirements of 1711, which results in us also being evaluated on a 4-year cycle to maintain our recognition. So we're being accredited as well, so to speak.
And so generally, when you're inspecting and accrediting labs, are you using the 17025 standard in looking at the laboratories?
Absolutely.
All right. And in the event that you were to work here in New York, at the direction of the commission, and the commission felt that there were things they wanted to add to the 17025 standards, is that something that your organization is open to or is willing to work with?
Yes, we would entertain that idea in that we do that for many other programs where we offer the baseline ISO 17025 and then additional requirements as prescribed by, in your case, New York. So those laboratories would know up front what the additional requirements are, and then we would assess to those requirements.
Thank you.
Sorry, go ahead.
What labs in New York State? You said 2 in Albany. What labs are there?
They're actually not, well, one is a lab and the other is a proficiency testing provider. So we have the Department of Health, New York State Department of Health Proficiency Testing Provider Program. They offer environmental samples, operate the environmental schemes. Yes. So asbestos and I believe drinking water. And then the other laboratory is the New York State Department of Agriculture and Marketing, I believe. Is that right? Laboratory.
The next question I have is, based on the information that was given to us, there was a question presented to all of the ones we're considering. How many forensic science assessors do you have? And the answer given by your organization was 28. The answer given by ANAB is 1,171. I will be honest with you. In my other life as the district attorney of Oneida County, I've been involved in situations where we've contracted with people. And to give an analogy, it's like sometimes you deal with people that can build a house, but they contract to build a skyscraper and they just don't have the people or the ability. And that's what concerns me when I see these 2 numbers. It's a glaring, huge difference between the size of your organizations, and I just don't know if those numbers are incorrect based upon what you said, or is that something we should be concerned with? Because if we're going to choose you over ANAB, to me, one of the most important things that I need to make a decision on is, can you handle the project this size?
So my response to that is the figure of 28 is pretty accurate. The figure of, I can't speak for ANAB, and 1,000 labs, or I'm sorry, 1,000 assessors. But We are prepared to ramp up our program. We have the accreditation model that has been in place for 40 years to meet different requirements as growth occurs. Being provided with a plan, if we are provided with a plan of the number of labs that's going to be undertaken, the number of accreditations allowed to perform the work, the time scale, we will prepare and have resources in place. That's part of ISO. Labs have to prepare with what samples may be coming in. Accreditation bodies have to be prepared to have resources in place.
The last question I have is, why should I or why should we pick you over ANAB, who we're using now? Just tell me why. What do you give us that would be better than them?
Well, and that was my point of not an us and them, but I think highlights of our programs, which I described in my opening remarks, of the assessor monitoring. The assessors are what we consider the crown jewels of our association. They're the faces in the laboratories. And if you don't send an appropriate match, an appropriate assessor in, that's going to kill you business-wise. Not just with that one customer, but the word will spread. So it's essential that we have the appropriate technical experts on site. And not only that, but the importance of the work they're doing. We don't really want to be accrediting bad labs either. So that's crucial. So I think the importance of having assessors that have the technical expertise to meet the job requirements and the customer service to be open and available and supportive to the laboratories that are seeking accreditation, to have an open dialogue with them to meet their needs, but to hold them at the same time. That doesn't mean you don't hold them to the firm requirements, stringent requirements. So in a nutshell, the expertise of our assessors and the customer service focus of our organization. And you're a customer as well. Our labs are customers, but you, being a user of our accreditation program, are a customer. And so we would be focused on meeting your needs as well.
Thank you.
How many forensic labs are you currently accrediting, and in what disciplines?
Okay, so currently we have 20 laboratories accredited. As far as their disciplines, it's across a wide range. I would simply advise you to, or I can provide the group the scopes of accreditations for those. But we accredit like Customs and Border Patrol, the U.S. Customs and Border Patrol labs, which have some over those 8 or 9 locations have various different disciplines on them. But it's across the board what we...
You accredit DNA, forensic DNA labs?
Yes.
Do you know how many?
Not off the top of my head, but a handful. Plus, there's other DNA laboratories that we have accredited in other industries as well. So.
Do you know what the DNA, is it more or less than 5 or more or less than 10 in terms of DNA labs you accredit?
I would have to get back to you, but I would say it'd be between 5 and 10, I would say.
Right.
I think from just communications that my office has had with the Office of Forensic Services, we're looking at about 17025 labs that you have, and another 3 that are 17020, which is a different accreditation program. Mm-hmm. And I think the DNA labs, is about 4. So it's give or take, it's in the range of what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm. Ann?
Your assessors are paid for their time? And are they full-time employees, or they have other jobs and they do this?
They have other jobs. It's a model that's worked for us. By having other jobs, they can remain, or they can be current on the technologies, and allows them, we wouldn't have the work to provide, especially right now, to provide a full-time position for these assessors. So they're contracted.
And how do you decide how many to send and how long the assessment will take?
We do that based on the scope of accreditation that the laboratory is applying with, what they've selected, and what the breadth of skills and technologies that a given assessor has. And also, we don't want to be on site for an extensive amount of time. On-site assessments can disrupt the business practice of the laboratory, so we want to keep it to 2-3 days on site, depending on the scope. So that would all weigh in on the number of assessors on a team.
When you review their casework, Randy, how do you select what files to look at? Do you let the lab pick them, or do you folks?
What we definitely emphasize to the assessors is that we want them to ask for the files. We want them to kind of dictate what files to look at. And it can even be helpful to ask in advance, hey, we're looking for these type of files, and maybe have the assessor pick a date. But that's only if it's, looks like it could be time consuming to retrieve the records. Ideally, at the opening session, they'll say, yes, I'll need records or case files for, and then I tell our assessors to say, from November 3rd, or, pick a random date or a random project or something, so that the labs aren't dictating or aren't, hey, here's, our best files, our best records. So we understand that that's important.
So I just have a couple of quick questions. So during your initial discussions about the transparency during accreditation, you talked about encouraging root cause analysis if there's findings during the assessment. Is that encourage or require?
Root cause analysis, that's required as part of their corrective action response to any findings.
Okay. One of the other things was when Commissioner Green had mentioned the idea of maybe some New York specific standards, I think you said something like you would entertain or consider it, but I guess I'm looking for a little more specifics of, is that a yes or a no?
Yes.
Okay.
We would establish, if needed, if this is what is the objective of your group, we could create an accreditation program, a New York State accreditation program that would be based on ISO 17025 and or ISO 17020, and that would have your additional accreditation requirements. The thing that can cause issues if there are labs that work in other states as well, they might be reluctant, but at the same time, you have the baseline requirements of 17025, and you could cross-check and make sure they're also meeting the New York requirements. And if they're seeking accreditation for other areas, you can still, providing that the requirements don't conflict, you can still be able to do that in one assessment.
So currently you have the 17025 program, and then you have your own supplementals. So this would be an added layer just for New York labs that would be in addition to the ISO 17025 and your supplementals. So just looking at the hierarchy, you have to conform with 17025, you have to conform with your supplementals, and then if there's a New York requirement, New York labs would have to comply with that as well, right?
Yes, and you would go with the more stringent requirement provided.
Right.
Yeah.
So
it would be, if New York had a watered down requirement on 17025, we obviously couldn't. But if you have, we would go with more strict requirements.
Right. But I guess there's one follow-up question that I have about that then. If you have the ISO standard of 522 says management, and if you want to look at this in the binders, it's on page 56 and 57. And I don't know, Shelley or Jackie, maybe you can just pass one over for him as well so we can see what we're looking at. So there's one specific supplemental standard that you guys have that I'm curious of how you handle in New York. So this ISO standard under 522 is the management shall formulate the goals with respect to education, training, and skills of lab personnel. The lab shall have a policy and procedure for identifying training needs and providing training of personnel. The training program should be relevant to the present and anticipated tasks of the lab, and the effectiveness of the training actions shall be evaluated. So that's the ISO standard. So the people we're looking at have to conform to that. you have a specific supplemental standard where you have 52F1.2 of professional certification. All examiners, analysts shall maintain or be in the process of obtaining certification in the primary discipline which they approve to perform testing when available and applicable. So it talks about the American Board of Criminalistics and IEI and other ones like that. But I guess, in this body, we've had discussions about this idea of mandatory certification, and there's clearly some obstacles to it within New York, union regulations, things like this. So I'm curious if we look to adopt your program, how do we do that? Because essentially the way I'm interpreting this is that that standard precludes a laboratory that doesn't have analysts that are on the path to certification.
We realize we're kind of being advanced there in that in that requirement, and so that's why we have or is in the process, because often there aren't any professional certifications in place, or that it can be difficult for some laboratories to achieve that or have the funds, but we want to see that something's in place, that they're starting to think about it, so it's an evolving thing. With New York, I guess there could be two approaches. We work out some agreeable means on this, or you provide us with your take on that, and we would run that through our advisory council, our forensics advisory council that provides the criteria advisory committee. Or we have a New York program that's just 17025 and the New York requirements.
But just, I guess, going to that, if we look at firearms examiners, and there's a fairly robust certification program through the AFTI that has a certification program, and of the, I think, 85 to 90 examiners in the state, I think 3 are eligible to take it because it requires a bachelor's degree in a natural science to qualify to take it. So if their bachelor's degree is not in natural science or something like that, they are ineligible to even consider taking it. So in that situation, that particular standard, if maintained, would essentially mean that New York State examiners couldn't do firearms exams. So I guess if there's an option of getting a different standard, that would be one thing that's interesting. But I'm concerned if you can modify the existing standard to meet the requirements that we're looking for, because I guess my concern is then it's not really a standard. One last question, though, I have on the paid assessors is when we have paid assessors that come in, so these are people that are currently working in laboratories, right?
Or academia or other.
Right. Yeah. But I guess, and I think this has been part of the ABFT program and the historical ASCOT lab program. I don't know where ANAM's going to go with this yet, but I guess my concern from coming from lab management is if laboratories are going to allow people to take time off to do these things if they're getting paid. So then people are going to have to start using vacation time, and if they have to start using vacation time, people become more frugal because that's taking away from their personal time, so they won't do it. So you might end up with a shortage of assessors by the fact that it's paid versus volunteer, where if it's volunteer, everyone has a finger in the pie. They let their people go because they're not doing a side job, and they let them go on company time. So I wasn't sure if that would be something that you would consider reevaluating, because I think it just might cause a shortage of assessors in the future. That's just a personal opinion. I don't know if it would actually come to fruition, but I don't know if that makes sense.
Well, I'm always open to hearing different ideas and taking them back. The approach, the model we've had in place has worked over the years, and we can work with assessors, unique, how do I put this, arrangements through contracts. Like I know of a couple of assessors that have a hardship, not in the forensics area, but they have a hardship with their companies that we've been able to work out other arrangements with their parent company to ensure that they're able to perform work because they see the benefits of providing that, and their companies see that. So it's something I will certainly take back and to the higher management to inform them of, to see what we could put into place or to reconsider.
Marvin, you've been waiting patiently.
All right, I have a few questions. Thank you very much, sir, for coming. First question is rather simple. What year did A2LA first get into assessing or accrediting forensic labs?
We launched the Forensics Accreditation Program in 2010. We had organizations that were doing forensics work, but that were accredited under other accreditation fields, such as biological and chemical. So we've been doing it for more than 7 years, but truly the Forensics Accreditation Program was launched in 2010.
Okay. Between 2010 and today, approximately, if any, how many labs has your organization placed on probation, suspended, or revoked their accreditation?
Very difficult to answer. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but the revoking test off of scopes, I don't want to say is common, but it's more of a regular occurrence due to proficiency testing outliers, for example, multiple fails. We may remove a test from we would remove a test from the scope. But as far as adverse actions, they do occur. They've occurred even for government labs that we have accredited. So it's, it's something that it happens. And I don't have a number. It's really not a frequent occurrence, but it's something that, that does occur. And we have processes in place for conducting for-cause assessments, for conducting assessments out of cycle. We have had to suspend labs during on-site assessments due to the number and nature of the findings. So it's part of accreditation. It's not a positive thing, but it is useful. It's it's just part of the accreditation process.
Would it be possible for you, once you get back to your office, to get that specific information and send it to the commission on the numbers?
Yes, I can do that.
Great. My next question concerns a complaint process. Sometimes here in New York and in other states, a defense attorney will be cross-examining a lab technician from an accredited lab that, let's say, for example, you've accredited. And the cross-examination is highly successful. The laboratory technician is discredited, and the defense attorney feels compelled, as an officer of the court, to file a complaint with the accreditation body of the lab. In that case, it might involve, here in New York, sending a letter to this commission, but it is not unheard of, and certainly was the case with Askeladd Lab, that the defense attorney would send a formal letter to the accrediting agency itself. So my question to you is, do you have in place a complaint system for the ordinary citizen or attorneys, whether they be prosecutors or defense attorneys, and how do you handle those complaints? And specifically, do you notify the complainant of the results of your investigation? And when I say specifically, more than just, yes, we have found your complaint valid, or no, we have not found your complaint valid. Do you send a report to the complainant?
We do have a complaint system in place that's been through many, many years of vetting. It's one complaint system, so it doesn't segregate the common citizen from specific groups or anything. It's a complaint system. We would receive that complaint. We have a quality manager, that would investigate and then pull in whatever needed resources, such as a previous assessor or a previous assessment team, to help with that investigation and approach the laboratory in a manner to be able to perform that investigation. The results then provided back to the complainant are not to the degree that would, reveal too much. We would be pretty sensitive and cautious to that. At the end of the day, we want to see that complaint has been investigated and that the laboratory is operating, meeting the requirements of accreditation, especially to that specific requirement.
Is there in place currently in A2LA an appellate process for a laboratory who you have found to be derelict in some of the rules and regulations of 170.25 or your rules and regulations? How does that appellate process work? And in the event you were the accrediting body selected by New York, would the documents of that appellate process be made available to this commission?
The appeals process is the laboratory. It would start, say it was a contested deficiency or a contest whatever. Say we were to revoke a test or have an adverse action. The laboratory has an appeals process they can follow. They can request and follow through with A2LA. It starts with the Accreditation Council. If they appeal the Accreditation Council's decision, it goes from that 3 or 4 member or however member board to a 9-member board of the Accreditation Council. If they appeal that, it goes even to a greater appeal level. As far as can that go to your group, it would have to be we would have to ask for a release from the laboratory, as that is part of confidentiality. The other aspect is, I believe, New York, State, your group could make that a requirement of the accreditation process, and laboratories would have to know that in advance of applying for accreditation through this program.
Currently, that's a sufficient answer, and it tells me exactly what I needed to know. Can you quickly just give us an example of how your fee structure is based for the different labs in a state? So we have many labs here in New York under our jurisdiction, I think 20, I could be wrong, but some are bigger than others. How is your fee based with respect to each lab when you do an on-site accreditation assessment?
So it's, we have an $800 application fee, we have an annual fee, and then we have complexity fees depending on what disciplines the laboratory is applying for. And then we also have a level in there depending on the size of the laboratory. That is how many technicians are working there. Okay. So it's definitely based on how much time we feel we need to be on site to do a thorough assessment. So it's the size.
Okay. I want to just return to a question you were asked earlier. I didn't quite understand the answer. If your assessment team shows up at a laboratory and it fans out and it goes to the fiber section of the lab, when you walk into the fiber section, do you select the files to be reviewed, or do you ask the head of the section or the head of the lab to select the files in advance?
It could happen either way. It may happen, sometimes at the opening briefing, assessors may say, hey, I need to see a case file from this area or this area, and they may say a specific date or something so that it's random. It could also happen when they're back in the lab in conversing, they could ask for it at that time. There's no requirement that they request it during the opening briefing. It just can, if there's going to be a time element in place, we want it to be efficient.
Mike, I have two more questions. Can I just finish up?
Absolutely.
Great. Can you please give us your definition from A2LA of who is the customer?
The customer is twofold. The laboratory is our customer, but those entities relying on our accreditation is also a customer.
Well, let me ask you, based on that definition, if I'm a criminal defense attorney in New York and I have a case where there's a forensic issue and I send a request to your lab for the results, to your accreditation agency, for the results of the last 5 accreditations of the lab, or for your assessment notes, or whatever it is I think you might have, because I need it for discovery for a trial for cross-examination. Is the defense bar one of the customers as an entity relying on your services?
From the sense we would have to respond in some manner and respond timely, but following appropriate procedures.
I don't know what that means.
And
I'm a defense attorney. I'm not allowed to cross-examine you, sir. I can only ask questions.
We'd have to respond, but we would, I don't know if you'd be considered a customer or not. It's, he's responding.
To answer your question for you, Marvin.
That was from the prosecutors. Don't worry about that.
Don't listen to
I
him.
know when I buy a car, I'm a customer, and then I don't spend the next month trying to denigrate the salesman and find out that he lied in high school on his bio exam. Okay, so this
You would
customer.
if your transmission fell out.
All right, did you have one more question, Marvin?
I did. All of your accreditation rules, regulations, are they available online for the world to see?
No.
Why?
They were, well, I'm getting it. Not too long ago, the majority of them were available online. We recently updated our website where many of those documents were removed. This displeased customers, therefore the documents are being returned to our newer website. But there are some programs where the general requirements are available, but maybe not the entire documents due to copyright issues more than anything. But once we receive information from those parties that are requesting the information, we can provide it to them. So we try to do that in a timely fashion within 24 hours.
I take it that notwithstanding copyright issues, that if you were selected as the accrediting body by this commission, you would provide a complete copy of your rules and regulations to every member of the commission.
Yes.
But you don't do that for the general public at large.
Right. It's as simple as ISO 17025. ISO has copyright on that. Therefore, we can't allow our checklist to be on site because it contains the full writing of the requirements. So first, we have to ensure that the under, I think it's the fair use, I forget what it's called legally, fair use clause or whatever. We have to ensure all parties have that standard before we can then release our checklist to that party.
Thank you, Mike.
Otherwise, we try to have...
No, thank you, Marvin. Anyone else in New York? Scott?
Good. Some of this has already been covered, just so I get a little more granular. Regards to the 28 assessors you have, how many of them approximately work in public funded laboratories, forensic laboratories?
I couldn't answer that. I mean, it's certainly something I could follow up with, but I don't really have a good number for
in
you.
regards to doing an assessment, for a laboratory of say 40 to maybe 40 examiners, how long would you be on site, and how many assessors would you send?
Could you repeat the details again?
Sure. A laboratory between 30 to 40 forensic examiners. How many assessors would you send on site for their full assessment, and for how long?
How many technologies are involved? How many, forensic disciplines?
So let me use my laboratory then. So we have maybe 16 different categories of testing, 255 examiners. How long do you think you would be on site, and how many examiners do you think you would send? Assessors, sorry.
It's a difficult question to answer without actually seeing the technologies or the list of tests. Again, we would want to ensure that there is a true coverage of the technologies being requested for accreditation. And based on that, we may have to send 6, 8 assessors. But the idea would be we would limit, it doesn't mean that all 8 or, the multiple number of assessors would have to be there for the full duration of the assessment. Frequently, our assessor teams are 3 or 4 assessors, but it really depends on the scope of accreditation being asked, and we try to make that pretty open to the laboratory at the time of the application, or when maybe they'll ask for an estimate up front. We try to provide those details clearly to them at the start.
In regards to the Accreditation Council, you had mentioned there may be like 3 people would give approval. They would review all the documents that were generated on site. Of those 3 individuals on the Accreditation Council, are they part of the 28 technical assessors, or are they some other individual with no forensic background?
They would not be an individual with no forensics background.
Sorry, that was double negative for me. If you could, would they have a forensic background or not?
The only time we may rely on an assessment package going to an accreditation council member that would not be forensics would be if the assessment resulted in deficiencies that were clearly quality in nature, like internal auditing or document control, but did not have any technical bearing, forensics-wise, or if there were no deficiencies cited at all.
So
otherwise, we would rely on a forensics expert that serves on the Accreditation Council. And then the other part is, yes, some of the forensics assessors also serve on the Accreditation Council. However, they would not be able to review and vote on the assessment package that they were assigned to as an assessor.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Anyone else in New York? me just one question. Have you, or has your organization ever been in a position where you have accredited or been asked to accredit a laboratory whose accreditation was suspended or revoked by another accrediting body?
I'm sure it happens. It's difficult to determine sometimes if that's what occurred.
So what if any procedures do you have in place to determine that, and what if any standards do you have in place in a situation like that? Like, for example, if you ascertained that that was the case, the lab was currently under suspension from another accrediting body, would you require them to clear up that suspension first before they move to you, or would you step in and do something different?
Well, what can be done is I don't know if we'd have any indication unless someone identified it to us, but we are required to put on our website adverse actions, such as these are labs that are currently suspended, these are labs that have been enforced withdrawn. So that's right on our website, on our directory search page. So anyone can go there. That's public information. So we could go to other ILAC recognized accreditation bodies because they would have that listed as well. So ANAB would have that listed. We could do that. As far as would that change our overall process, it would certainly perk our ears, such to say that we would be attentive, but it would be the same accreditation process. We do a rigorous on-site assessment, and find out. But where they stand, if we believe they meet the requirements of accreditation. It would be tough if they currently have a suspended accreditation and we know that. I think we would have to heavily investigate that, to determine what is in place and what has been done to correct it and what the current status of that is.
Right, thank you. Mm-hmm. Ann?
We currently have two organizations that we allow to accredit our forensic labs, either ABFT if they're a forensic tox lab, or ANAB for basically all the others. Would you care to comment on if we were to add additional accrediting organizations, not as the sole accreditor, but just as another option for the lab? Comment on whether you think that's a good idea, bad idea, what conflicts or possible problems you see?
So I think what's important is that the requirements be the same for all the accreditation bodies participating in your program. And so if everyone's held to the same requirements and are required to assess to the same requirements, there's plenty of industry sectors that are shared by many accreditation bodies. So it's just this American way. It's competition. And so if everyone's held the same and you're getting a consistent accreditation result from the accreditation bodies,
I think you can imagine that's not easy to accomplish when we look at, each organization has its own standards on top of international standards, and then we throw in the New York standards, and uniformity is probably not easy to attain. So since it would be competitive if we added yet another, I know it depends on the size of the lab, the complexity of the lab, the time spent, but an average cost to a forensics lab? I know that's putting you on the spot, but
it's really difficult to come up with that. Even an average cost, even if we have just a mere pool of 20 labs, they're all very different. from the size, the location, what they test.
Of the 20 you accredit now, forensics labs, do you know what the range of fees?
What I would suggest is, if you want harmonization and, of your accreditation bodies, you could ask all of them, hey, here's three cases of labs. Here's here's what they test, number of employees, where they're located. What would you charge?
Or we could ask you, I don't care about the list of who they are, but you said you would provide us with sort of the scope of the 20 you have. How big are they? What disciplines do they have? And you could provide us with the fees they pay. I don't care who they are. Just if it's a lab that has 17 disciplines and 200 employees, they paid X. And if it's a lab that has...
We could...
Or
we can provide you some ranges.
Yes, that's all we need.
Or if
examples.
you were provided with the specifics on the New York State labs that you would be asked to potentially
we could do that too.
Assess, and you knew where they are, the number of assessors, the different disciplines, could you give us a
We
ballpark
could provide that. An
figure
example.
for the cost and the number of days that you'd be there?
Because I think our laboratories will be concerned if the fees are significantly different than what they're used to, because they pay their own fees.
Unless they're less.
Huh?
Unless they're significantly less.
Yeah, right. Well, yeah, that could be.
All right. Anything else? Scott?
Sorry, just one last question, just so I fully understand. A2LE does a full assessment on all criteria every 2 years?
Yes. Full assessment? Yes.
Thank you.
Full scope of accreditation. Yep.
And that full assessment every 2 years is on-site, just what you described to us about the team of people?
Yes.
All right, thank you. Appreciate you being here, and we will be back in touch.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
The next item we have under old business, we did, I believe, get a request from one or more commissioners to be provided with any comments that came in with regard to the familial search regulations. I believe that 45-day comment period closed this past week, and we provided in your materials the 4 comments we received, one from the Sheriff's Association, one from the Innocence Project, one from the New York Civil Liberties Union, and one from the Legal Aid Society. Any questions on that?
Only so probably by the next meeting we'll have an assessment of these comments. I mean, these are the comments. They're lengthy and they're substantive.
And I think the question is, at least one of the questions is there anything in there that is new or substantially different? We went through a process as a commission to try and get as much input as we could before we developed and finalized the regulations. So to the extent that this is, basically restating or resubmitting what we've already considered, that would be one thing. If there's, completely new material in here, that would be another.
Well, since I just got these, an hour and a half ago, I can't comment on that, but presumably the agency has to comment on that.
Yeah,
and what's your time frame for trying
I think at least
to do that?
3 of these came in either on the last day or the day before the comment period closed. But our time frame would be to move as soon as we can on them.
But 3 of these 4 are extensive and not favorable, just from my speed.
Yeah.
So presumably there's going to have to be, I don't know whether you'll reconsider, but
if
Marvin and I would hope you would reconsider.
If it's a restatement of everything that we've heard already and considered and took into account, then I don't see going back through and rehashing the whole process just because we're being given the same information again. If it's completely new and different information, we didn't have a chance to consider.
So you would anticipate the possibility of promulgating these rules based on the agency's assessment of these comments without coming back to the commission?
Yes.
I'm not happy with that position, but...
So I guess what I would say then is, we are in the process of doing a full review of the submissions. We're in the same position you are in terms of them having just come in. If you or anyone else feels that there is significant material in there that was not brought to our attention before and that the commission did not have a chance to consider, let us know that sooner rather than later.
I guess I would like to make a motion then.
Okay.
That when the assessment of public comment has been completed by the agency, that assessment be shared with the members of the commission to potentially allow members of the commission to comment on whether or not, just to offer our input as to whether or not there are additional concerns. I'm not saying delay promulgation. I'm just saying I want to know what your assessment is before I see it published with the rules promulgated.
All right, so the motion is that DCJS, Office of Forensic Services, share the assessment of the public comments with the commission members when it's done.
And you can give us 5 days to comment. It doesn't have to be a long time period.
All right, is there a second? You've seconded the motion, Marvin?
I did.
Any discussion on the motion? All right. All in favor? We have 1, 2, 3, 4. All opposed? We have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. All right.
I guess I'll look in the state register for the assessment. Could I then ask, just ask, when it's published, would you share a copy?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
The next item we have are lab disclosures. Brian, do you want to walk us through the lab disclosures?
Sure, and the first one is the DCJS latent print laboratory. It's a closure of a previously reported nonconformance. Marvin, I believe you wanted to talk to the lab director on that? Is that still true, Marvin? Page 123 of your binder. The original binder?
The original binder, 123. I have a question.
Okay.
With respect to pages 123 and 124, could someone explain this in English? What is this about?
Maybe you can just identify yourself first.
I'm the lab director. My name is Bharat Lakhar, and I'm the lab director of the latent print laboratory of DCJS. We reported a non-conformance last year in December. What had happened was, let me explain the process. When we get fingerprints from crime scene, we do a database search and try to identify potential candidates. Then we do comparisons, and if we cannot find any fingerprints that match it, those fingerprints stay in the database, and they keep on getting searched constantly. And as a result of that, these kind of candidates, which are potential candidates, they keep on getting generated constantly forever till that particular crime is solved. So as a result of that, every day, probably per analyst, 20, I'm giving a very rough figure, about 20 candidates get generated. And in fact, there are even more candidates get generated for people who have already left the lab, because they also have some unsolved cases in the database. So such thousands of candidates get generated, and they have to be looked at by analysts to see if the potential candidate matches this unsolved particular fingerprint. Because of the sheer volume of this work, when the comparison results in a negative result, results in a negative in the sense it does not match, nobody reviews that case. There's no way to review 10,000 such evaluations. When they result in identifications, definitely they undergo the whole review process because a new report gets generated. When there is no match, nobody comes up with a report. As a result of that, there is no review. So when we came to know of an incident where we had missed something, we reported to the commission, even though we were not sure, because that was really a false negative and not false positive. So it was not that serious in nature. However, what happened was, there was a period of about 6 months that went before we realized that this is what had happened. So we made a decision to let the commission know anyway that this is what had happened. And the root causes that we identified were twofold. One is, from our perspective, too many candidates were being generated, so that when analysts were looking at them every morning, they were going through 20 such fingerprint comparisons within a period of, let's say, about 10 minutes or 15 minutes.
How many candidates here?
Sorry?
How many candidates in how many minutes?
I would say about 10 minutes, 20 candidates. This is a very rough estimate, please, because sometimes it might be a complex comparison. It might take longer. But when they are reviewing these thousands of things, when they are encountering constant negatives, there's a chance that you will make a mistake and you will miss an identification. So that was one possibility. The second possibility was, root cause that we identified was, there was no review that was being conducted. And although we realized that conducting a review is an onerous task, it's very difficult to do this, we instituted those reviews in April and we reported to the commission. From April to now, we have dealt with close to 4,000 such comparisons, and we have not found a single instance where a wrong result was noticed. As a result of this, in fact, we realized that that incident which took place was just one of a kind. Otherwise, we would have noticed that there's a problem. So at this stage, we would like to close this corrective action. So that's why the notification was sent that it's not possible to continue these reviews forever because it will put so much burden on the lab. So we have looked at 4,000, and since we did not see an indication that there's a pattern to these kind of errors, we would like to stop these reviews, and we have done the evaluation, and we have not noticed any systemic problem.
Yeah.
Yes, Marvin.
So if I understand it correctly, the errors that were previously discovered, you feel are isolated, and there's no reason
Yes, there was only
to
one.
continue
There was
doing
only, that is correct. Yes.
Okay.
And just when you say errors, it was one error?
Yes, there was one error.
All right, thank you.
Thank you. All right, the next laboratory is the New York City Office of Chief Medical Examiner Forensic Toxicology Laboratory. They're essentially closing out a previous corrective action. Documents are in your binder starting on page 127. If there's any questions, there's representatives from the lab here. Go ahead, Martin. Do you have a question for the lab?
Yes.
Okay.
So most of my questions are addressed to the double check method, and then I have one very specific question. First, the double check method, as you point out, there are some double check methods that are better than others.
Yes.
The one that's the best has now been instituted.
Yes.
So we've cleared that problem.
Yes.
Okay. Now, on February 14th, in the chronology of what happened here, it says you corrected the report. You amended the report.
That's right, yeah.
Now, that report, is that a piece of paper? Is it a document?
Yeah.
Okay. When you amended the document, did it note on the document, we found this, or this happened, that didn't happen, and we're amending it? Is that what it now says on the report?
No, it has, the title changes from a report to an amended report.
To an amended report?
Yes.
But it doesn't say what the nature of the amendment is?
No, that's in the case file.
That's in the case file. And does the amendment, when you make this change, is it entered into the LIM system?
No, we don't enter anything into our LIM system. Unfortunately, our LIM system is not compatible with data entry.
It's not.
No.
So it's only the report.
Yes.
So if an attorney, a prosecutor or a defense attorney, is looking at documents from your lab requested pursuant to a subpoena, and they see the word amended report, that would be a signal that behind that amended report, there's something that indicates that something else happened previously.
Yes.
Now, if you get the case file and you see this document that says amended report, where in the case file do you go to see what happened previously?
So within the case file, we have the original report and the amended report, and we also have cross-reference to any investigation or nonconformity or root cause analysis. So all of that information is in the case file.
When you put in the case file the amended report, do you staple it together with the original report, or it's two separate documents?
They're all loose leaf because they are scanned and available for scanning. So
right.
staples
So they're just thrown back in the file.
They're placed carefully inside the file.
Right. To use the legal and the Latin term helter-skelter.
No.
No.
They're very carefully placed, and the most recent report is on the top.
So it's chronological.
Yes.
So if I see amended report on February 14th, 2017, I need to go backwards in time to see the original report.
Yes.
Okay, and that is the standard procedure in the lab.
It is.
Is that across all divisions of the lab?
I can't comment on other divisions.
Well, in your section, which is the
Forensic Toxicology Laboratory.
Right. In your section, that's the standard way to do it.
It is.
And when you ask for the case file for the particular case, would it have to be the case file generally, or just the one that's held in your section?
So there is only the case file in my section. There are no other associated case files. Everything that's done in forensic toxicology is within the individual case file, yes.
And that's where you'd find the original and the amended
Absolutely,
report.
yes.
Thank you very much. That's all I have.
All right. The next laboratory is the New York City Police Department. They have an initial report. If anyone has any questions, we've got Dr. O'Neill at the table. Starts on page 145.
I had a question. So as we discussed briefly earlier this morning, this was a case of the evidence in the can. Correct?
Yeah, entered into the trash, yes.
Right. So the way it's been solved is we've now taken these bags and given them a color?
They're labelled.
Right.
The bags are labelled and they're retained for a longer period of time in the laboratory than what we had when we had an incident a couple of years ago.
Right.
So in this instance, the analyst discovered the following day that the evidence was not present, reported to the supervisor, and we followed the bag and found out where the bag was, and because of our current process, from our learning from a couple of years ago, we're able to recover the evidence.
Recover. Let me just ask one last question on this. I thought there was a rule at the end of the day, when you have your lab bench, that any evidence that you have in bags is supposed to be sent back to whence it came to prevent this sort of thing.
That's not the way it works in our laboratory. Our analysts have a storage location, a locked cabinet box with a padlock, and they lock that in another padlock. So they actually, it takes many days to do analysis.
Right.
So they have that at what we call progress. So they have a storage location.
Is that storage location located at each specific lab analyst bench?
Yes.
So what happened here was the analyst didn't put it back in that locked bench?
That box, yes, correct.
I see. That was the problem. And that's why it was left out. And then,
well, it would appear, and we're still doing the investigation,
right,
that because of to minimise any possibility of contamination, we place what's called bench paper on the bench,
right,
so we can make sure we don't leave powder on the bench.
Gotcha.
So the analysts cleaned up their bench. The analyst cleans up their area, and in the process they've cleaned it up and collected it with the evidence. So one of the solutions we're considering right now is of course white bench paper. It was a white glassine. So we're going to maybe try different contrast of bench paper so the examiner can see more clearly. Look, I have something. So,
thank you very much. Thank you, Mark.
Dr. O'Neill, again, just to clarify, this isn't like a kilo of cocaine. This is a small glassine.
Yes, correct. There was a small one item.
And the extra system you put in place of actually labeling garbage bags means you don't have to go dumpster diving looking through ketchup packets and
we did dumpster
all
diving
sorts of other fun stuff.
I do it again. No,
okay.
Correct.
Heroes will use different garbage bins.
Thank you.
Okay, the next laboratory is the New York State Police Laboratory. Just a disclosure that we have. It starts in your book on page 149.
149.
Jeez.
Okay, if there's no questions, the next laboratory is the Niagara County Sheriff's Office Forensic Laboratory. Starts on page 150.
Just on the last one.
Sure. Want someone from the lab?
Get to here, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mr. Wickenheiser, did you approve?
No, Ray, you don't have to get it. I just, on this UPS thief here, I assume it's an ongoing investigation?
Yes, it is.
Okay. Got some ideas. If you guys can't figure out how to catch the guy, I'm available.
Work for UPS?
Good to know.
I used to work for UPS.
All right. Sorry, the next laboratory is the Niagara County Sheriff's Department Forensic Laboratory. Starts on page 150. Okay, if there's no questions on that. Last one's the Suffolk County Office of Medical Examiner Toxicology Laboratory. Starts on page 156. All right, that concludes lab
anybody here on that?
Anyone from Suffolk Tox in New York City, Greg?
They're over phone if we need to call.
Over the phone if you need.
No, I'm just curious. If it wasn't blood, what the hell did they test?
I think in that situation there was a pipetting error, so the blood didn't get pipetted into the thing at all, so nothing was there at all.
So they tested air?
Yeah.
Okay.
And ironically, it was negative.
I know there's glass that floats in the air, right? Who told that? What else? Probably booze too, right?
All right, so that concludes the laboratory portion of the agenda.
All right, so the next item on the agenda is executive session. Do I have a motion to go into executive session to discuss matters relating to either a current investigation or matters that may lead to appointment, promotion, demotion, discipline, or suspension of a particular individual? I have a motion. Do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Anyone opposed? All right, we will go into executive session, so I would ask anyone who's not with the commission or the commission support staff to leave. With the exception of, I think for the first item we need...
They could go first.
Yeah, no, absolutely. So that's what I'm saying.
They want the others in the city to stay.
We're taking a 5-minute break, Mike.
And then we need to turn the recording back on as well. I assume someone's doing that.
This would have been very interesting.
That was going to be very interesting.
They don't know this,
Do we know the recording? All set? Great. All right, so we're back in open session. The doors have been open in both places. We're back recording. There was an issue that we did take action on in executive session. It related to a letter that was provided to us from the Inspector General that ultimately came from Legal Aid and the Federal Public Defender, as well as attachments. The motion had multiple parts, but the first was to table this till the next meeting so that everyone had a chance to review the information, which is voluminous and which, to a large extent, I think was provided to commission members either this morning or yesterday, and didn't give them enough time to review it. The second part of it was to provide a copy of the letter and the attachments to the DNA subcommittee and ask them to provide us with any appropriate feedback with regard to what's in the letter. The third was a request for the videotape of the meeting. I believe it's the October 24th, 2014 meeting that the exchange that's at the center of one of the three allegations in the letter took place at. The fourth is to ask two of the persons who are the focus of some of the accusations in the letter to see if they can be available for the next meeting of the commission. And the fifth is to have the Office of Forensic Services reach out to the OCME and confirm that they are no longer currently conducting the low copy testing referred to in the letter and using the forensic statistical tool. It was noted that the letter that we received indicates that that's the case, but the commission wanted confirmation of that. So that was the action that was taken. Any other comment or any other business before we adjourn? All right, if that's the case, do we have a motion to adjourn? Do we have a second? All right, all in favor? Anyone opposed? Any abstentions? All right, we had at least one unanimous vote at this meeting. And again,
But I vote no.
thank you. I appreciate everybody's time and the time you put in and your advocacy at this meeting. So thank you, everyone, and we'll see you at the next meeting.
Yeah, sure, buddy. Happy Thanksgiving. Any other holidays between them?
Halloween.
Halloween.
Rosh Hashanah.
Yeah, a couple of those.